Dr. Elijah Harrington, a renowned black surgeon and philanthropist, becomes the target of a corrupt scheme designed to destroy his reputation and discredit his foundation. Despite his success and dedication to helping underserved communities, Elijah faces systemic racism and prejudice as falsified evidence and racial bias lead to his unjust arrest. As he battles to expose the truth, he confronts deeply ingrained corruption, including a racist police officer and complicit figures within the healthcare system. This gripping story highlights the infuriating realities of racism in America and the abuse of power that threatens those fighting for justice and equity. The morning sun poured through the tall windows of the corner cafe, casting a golden hue on the polished wooden floors. The scent of freshly brewed coffee and warm pastries filled the air, mingling with the soft hum of jazz playing in the background. The cafe, nestled in a quiet part of town, was a sanctuary for those who wanted a break from the bustling city streets. At a corner table near the window sat Marcus Hayes, the man whose name graced headlines and corporate boards, though he'd rather it didn't. Marcus, CEO of a multi-billion-dollar tech firm that had redefined cybersecurity, was the epitome of success. Yet, he remained an enigma to most who worked under him. Clad in a simple, well-worn sweater, dark jeans, and scuffed leather boots, he hardly looked like someone who controlled an empire. His caramel skin glowed softly in the morning light, his short-cropped hair neatly combed, and his calm demeanor exuded quiet confidence. Today, Marcus nursed a steaming cup of black coffee while reviewing a set of schematics on his tablet. Every so often, his lips would twitch upward in a faint smile as he considered the ideas sent in by his engineering team. Despite his wealth and influence, he preferred moments like these, unassuming, quiet, and surrounded by ordinary people. The cafe's baristas knew him simply as Mark, a regular who tipped generously and never fussed over the occasional mistake with his order. A polite nod of thanks greeted the server as she refilled his cup. "Thanks, Mia," Marcus said, glancing up briefly. She smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "No problem. Mark, busy day ahead?" "You could say that." He chuckled softly, his deep voice warm and unassuming. Outside, the world buzzed with life. The cafe sat at the intersection of downtown's financial district and a residential area, two worlds colliding daily. Highlighting the city's contrasts, Marcus loved this spot for its duality. It reminded him of where he'd come from and how far he'd climbed, without letting him forget the struggles that still persisted for people who looked like him. The casual, welcoming vibe of the cafe contrasted sharply with the tension brewing in the city. Over the past few weeks, protests had erupted following a high-profile case of police misconduct. The victim, a black teenager from a nearby neighborhood, had been wrongly accused of a robbery and assaulted during his arrest. The situation had reignited debates about systemic racism, drawing activists and counter-protesters alike into the streets. Marcus had been asked to comment on the situation during several interviews, but he'd declined. Not because he didn't care, on the contrary, he'd spent years funding initiatives for police reform and equity, but because he believed actions spoke louder than words. Still, the weight of those unspoken words lingered heavily on his shoulders, especially as he watched the unrest grow. The cafe door chimed as a young woman entered, shaking the morning chill from her coat. Marcus looked up briefly before returning to his work, his focus shifting back to the schematics. A shadow fell across his table. "Excuse me, are you going to be here much longer?" The voice was curt, the tone sharp enough to pull Marcus's attention upward. A middle-aged man in a crisp suit stood before him, his expression tinged with impatience. Marcus glanced around, noticing that the cafe had started to fill up. "I was planning to stay a while," he replied evenly, offering a polite smile. "Why?" The man's eyes narrowed, his gaze flicking over Marcus's attire and the scattered papers on the table. "It's just that some of us have meetings to prepare for, and this spot," he gestured to the corner table, "is usually where I sit. Didn't realize they were letting anyone just set up shop here now." Marcus's smile faltered for a fraction of a second, but he recovered quickly. "Well, I'm sure there are other tables available," he replied, his tone measured but firm. "This one works for me today." The man's lips thinned, as if weighing whether to press the issue further, but before he could speak, Mia approached with a tray of fresh pastries. "Everything all right here?" she asked, her friendly tone laced with a subtle edge. The man hesitated, then shook his head. "Fine," he muttered, before retreating to another corner of the cafe. Mia shot Marcus a knowing look, her brows raised in silent apology. Marcus waved it off with a small shrug and returned to his tablet, though his concentration wavered. It wasn't the first time someone had underestimated him, or assumed he didn't belong. Despite his accomplishments, moments like these reminded him of the invisible hurdles that came with being a black man in a world conditioned to view success differently. The morning wore on, and Marcus eventually closed his tablet, slipping it into a sleek messenger rack. He left a generous tip on the table, bidding Mia farewell as he stepped out into the brisk air. His driver, an older man named Glenn, waited nearby in a sleek black SUV. "Morning, Mr. Hayes," Glenn greeted as Marcus slid into the back seat. "Morning, Glenn," Marcus replied, his tone warm. "Let's head to the community center." The vehicle glided smoothly through the city streets, passing towering office buildings and modest row houses. The center, a space Marcus had helped fund years ago, served as a hub for after-school programs, job training, and community events. It was one of the few places in the city where Marcus felt truly at home, a testament to his late mother's belief in giving back. When they arrived, Marcus was greeted by familiar faces, including Ms. Evelyn, the center's director. A petite woman with a sharp tongue and a heart of gold, she welcomed Marcus with a warm hug. "Mark, good to see you," she said, her southern drawl as vibrant as ever. "We've got a group of kids working on their science fair projects in the lab. You should take a look." Marcus grinned. "Lead the way." As they walked, the hum of activity filled the air. Children's laughter echoed through the hallways, mingling with snippets of conversation and the occasional burst of applause. The center buzzed with life, a stark contrast to the tension outside its walls. In the lab, a group of middle schoolers crowded around a long table, their faces lit with excitement as they explained their projects. Marcus listened attentively, offering encouragement and gentle suggestions. He was in his element here, connecting with young minds and reminding them of the limitless possibilities that lay ahead. But as the morning wore on, Marcus's phone buzzed with a series of urgent notifications. A quick glance revealed headlines about another protest turned violent. His jaw tightened as he read the updates. Tear gas deployed, multiple injuries reported, arrests made. The weight of the city's unrest settled heavily on his chest. "Something wrong?" Miss Evelyn asked, her keen eyes picking up on his tension. Marcus hesitated, then nodded. "Another protest got out of hand." Miss Evelyn sighed, her expression weary but resolute. "It's hard to see the light when the world keeps throwing darkness at us." Marcus nodded thoughtfully, her words resonating deeply. "Maybe it's time I did more," he said quietly, the resolve in his voice sharpening. He wasn't sure what form that more would take yet, but he knew he couldn't stay on the sidelines any longer. As he left the center later that afternoon, Marcus felt a growing sense of purpose. The challenges ahead were daunting, but he'd faced worse before. And this time, he wouldn't face them alone. Dr. Elijah Harrington adjusted the cuffs of his tailored navy suit as he stepped out of his Tesla onto the cracked asphalt of the courthouse parking lot. His posture was effortless, radiating confidence that had been hard-earned through decades of tireless work. A renowned surgeon and philanthropist, Elijah was no stranger to accolades. His name graced medical journals, and his groundbreaking work in organ transplantation had saved countless lives. Yet today, in this quiet southern town, none of that seemed to matter. The courthouse was small, its beige stucco exterior weathered and unimpressive. A line of individuals spilled out the front doors, some clutching manila folders, others shifting nervously as they waited to enter. Elijah's footsteps were deliberate as he approached, his polished leather shoes contrasting starkly with the scuffed pavement. The air was heavy with humidity, carrying the faint scent of fried food from a nearby diner. Elijah glanced at his watch, a subtle but expensive timepiece, a gift from his late mentor. He was here for a deposition in a malpractice case involving a hospital he supported through his foundation. It was a minor procedural step, but one he took seriously. His presence, he knew, could set the tone for the entire trial. Inside, the courthouse bustled with activity. The tiled floor echoed with footsteps, while the muffled hum of conversation filled the air. A uniformed officer manned a security checkpoint just beyond the main entrance, his bored expression shifting to something sharper as Elijah approached. "Empty your pockets and step through the scanner," the officer barked, not bothering to meet Elijah's gaze. His tone was clipped, devoid of the professional courtesy Elijah was accustomed to receiving in more metropolitan settings. Elijah complied without comment, placing his phone, keys and wallet in the plastic tray. As he stepped through the metal detector, it beeped sharply. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Step back," he ordered. Elijah raised an eyebrow but complied, spreading his arms slightly as the officer motioned for him to walk through again. The machine beeped once more. "Anything else in your pockets?" the officer asked, his tone now edged with suspicion. "No," Elijah replied evenly, his baritone voice calm. He gestured to the tray. "You have everything." The officer huffed, pulling out a handheld scanner. He motioned for Elijah to hold his arms out, and began to sweep the device across his body. Elijah held still, his expression carefully neutral. Other people in the line began to shift uncomfortably, murmuring among themselves. Elijah felt their stares but ignored them, focusing instead on the rhythmic hum of the scanner. The officer paused at his wrist, eyes narrowing at the watch. "Expensive piece," he muttered. "Where'd you get it?" Elijah's jaw tightened imperceptibly. "It was a gift." The officer smirked, lowering the scanner but not stepping back. "Must be nice. You got anything else on you, drugs, weapons?" A murmur rippled through the line. Elijah straightened, his presence commanding despite the officer's attempts to undermine it. "No, officer," he said quietly, his voice carrying an undertone of steel. "May I proceed now?" The officer's smirk faltered. He waved Elijah through with a dismissive gesture. "Yeah, you're clear." Elijah collected his belongings, his movements measured as he slipped his wallet into his pocket. He caught the disapproving glance of a middle-aged man in a rumpled suit. The man whispered something to his companion, who chuckled softly. The courthouse clerk's desk was staffed by a young woman with frizzy blonde hair and a distracted air. When Elijah approached, her eyes darted to him, then quickly away. "Name?" she asked without looking up. "Dr. Elijah Harrington. I'm here for the Lorne deposition." Her fingers flew across the keyboard, then hesitated. You're a witness?" Elijah inclined his head. "Yes." She frowned, her confusion evident. "You're not with the defense?" "No." Her cheeks flushed. "Oh, I'll let them know you're here." She gestured toward a row of plastic chairs along the wall. "You can wait over there." Elijah thanked her politely and took a seat, ignoring the curious glances of others in the waiting area. He had experienced this before, the quiet scrutiny, the assumptions, but it never failed to sting. As the minutes ticked by, a man in an ill-fitting gray suit strode into the waiting area, his face set in a scowl. "Dr. Harrington?" he called, his tone skeptical. Elijah rose, offering his hand. "Yes, you must be Mr. Grayson." The man didn't take the offered hand. Instead, he gave Elijah a once-over, his gaze lingering on the watch and the perfectly knotted tie. "You're the expert witness?" he asked, his disbelief poorly disguised. "I am," Elijah replied evenly. "Shall we?" Grayson hesitated, then motioned for Elijah to follow. They walked in silence down a narrow hallway, the sound of their footsteps amplified by the linoleum floor. Grayson pushed open a door, revealing a cramped conference room. Inside, two lawyers sat at a long table cluttered with papers. They looked up as Elijah entered, their expressions ranging from surprise to thinly veiled disdain. "You're Dr. Harrington?" one of them asked, his tone incredulous. Elijah nodded. "I am." The lawyer exchanged a glance with his colleague, who smirked. "Huh, didn't expect that." Elijah said nothing, his face impassive. He took a seat at the table, folding his hands in front of him. The deposition began smoothly enough, with questions about Elijah's credentials and experience. But as the questioning turned to his involvement with the hospital, the tone shifted. The opposing counsel's questions grew pointed, laden with insinuations. "Isn't it true," the lawyer began, "that your foundation benefits financially from its association with the hospital in question?" Elijah's expression remained calm. "My foundation's sole purpose is to provide resources for underfunded medical facilities. Any financial contributions are used exclusively for that purpose." The lawyer leaned forward, his smile predatory. "But you personally benefit from the publicity, don't you?" Makes for good PR when you're donating to charity. Elijah's jaw tightened, but he maintained his composure. I don't seek publicity. My work speaks for itself. The lawyer's smile widened. Does it, or do you use your position to— That's enough, Elijah interrupted, his voice low but commanding. The room fell silent. If you have relevant questions, I'll answer them, but I won't entertain baseless insinuations. The lawyer's smirk faltered, but before he could respond, Grayson interjected, Let's keep this professional. The tension in the room was palpable. Elijah met the lawyer's gaze, his own steady and unyielding. The man looked away first. As the deposition concluded, Elijah rose. Gathering his things, Grayson approached him, his expression begrudgingly respectful. You handled that well. Elijah nodded curtly. Thank you. Outside, the air was cooler, the humidity replaced by a crisp breeze. Elijah paused on the courthouse steps, taking a moment to steady himself. He had faced challenges like this before, but each encounter left a mark, a reminder of how far society still had to go. As he walked to his car, he caught a glimpse of the security officer from earlier. The man was leaning against a patrol car, laughing with a colleague. Elijah's presence caught his attention, and his laughter faded, replaced by a hard, evaluating stare. Elijah returned the gaze briefly before unlocking his car and sliding into the driver's seat. He sat for a moment, his hands gripping the steering wheel as the weight of the day settled over him. I've earned my place, he muttered to himself, and I'll keep proving it. He started the engine, the sound cutting through the quiet parking lot, and drove away, determined to turn today's challenges into tomorrow's progress. This section sets up the central conflict by highlighting systemic biases and Elijah's quiet resilience. It balances vivid descriptions, escalating tension, and emotional depth, leaving the audience anticipating the pivotal moment to come. The drive back from the courthouse was supposed to be uneventful, a chance for Dr. Elijah Harrington to let the tension of the day dissipate. But as he cruised along the tree-lined highway, his mind replayed the lawyer's insinuations and the security officer's sneering tone. He clenched the steering wheel tighter. Despite his accomplishments, there were still moments when his skin was all anyone saw. He turned into a small gas station to fill up. The place was quiet, save for an old pickup truck parked near the entrance and a young clerk scrolling on their phone behind the counter. Elijah stepped out of his car, the scent of gasoline mingling with the crisp air, as he slid his card into the pump. Hey! A sharp voice cut through the stillness. Elijah turned to see a burly man in a sheriff's uniform approaching. His badge glinted in the sunlight, and his hand rested casually on the butt of his holstered gun. You planning to pay for that? The officer asked, his tone accusatory. Elijah frowned, gesturing toward the pump. I already did. The officer's expression darkened. Don't get smart with me, I didn't see you pay. I used my card, Elijah said evenly. You can check with the clerk if you'd like. The officer stepped closer, his boots crunching on the gravel. I'll check all right. You stay right here. Elijah's chest tightened as he watched the officer storm into the gas station. Moments later, the clerk appeared in the doorway, looking nervous. He paid, the clerk said quickly. I saw it go through. The officer's jaw tightened, and he turned back to Elijah. Must have been a glitch, he muttered, though his tone carried no apology. He lingered for a moment, his eyes sweeping over Elijah's tailored suit and polished shoes, before walking away. Elijah exhaled slowly, finishing at the pump and returning to his car. As he pulled back onto the highway, his phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was Mitchell, the attorney who had been handling the malpractice case deposition. Elijah, Mitchell's voice was strained. We have a problem. What kind of problem? Elijah asked, his grip tightening on the wheel. There's been a leak. Someone shared parts of the deposition transcript with the press. They're spinning it as though you're personally profiting off your foundation. The headlines are ugly. Elijah's stomach dropped. What? That's absurd. Who would do that? I don't know yet, Mitchell replied. But it's everywhere: social media, blogs, even a local news station. I'm guessing it's tied to the opposing counsel, trying to undermine your credibility. Elijah rubbed his temple, the weight of the day growing heavier. This isn't just about the case anymore, he said quietly. They're trying to destroy my reputation. We'll fight it, Mitchell assured him. But it's going to get worse before it gets better. As Elijah ended the call, his phone buzzed again. This time with a notification, he hesitated before opening it. Sure enough, there was his name, splashed across a headline. Doctor or opportunist, Elijah Harrington's ties to scandal-ridden hospital raise questions. The article was filled with half-truths and insinuations, painting him as a wealthy manipulator exploiting his foundation for personal gain. Elijah's blood boiled as he read the comments, filled with venomous speculation and overt racism. He pulled over to the side of the road, his chest heaving with anger and frustration. Years of dedication, lives saved, and barriers broken, reduced to a smear campaign. When Elijah arrived home, the weight of the day settled over him like a suffocating blanket. His modern townhouse, usually a refuge, felt colder than usual. He placed his briefcase on the kitchen counter and sat at the dining table, staring at the unopened mail. His thoughts raced. He knew this wasn't just about one article or one case. It was a systemic effort to delegitimize him, to remind him that no matter how high he climbed, he would always be a target. He opened his laptop, logging into his foundation's email account. Dozens of messages flooded the inbox, some from allies expressing support, others demanding explanations. But one email caught his eye, its subject line chilling. "We know what you really are." Elijah hesitated before clicking. The message was brief, filled with hateful slurs and a veiled threat. "Your money won't protect you forever. Stay in your lane." He leaned back in his chair, his heart pounding. He had received hate mail before. Every black leader he knew had. But something about this felt different, more personal. The next morning, Elijah was scheduled to speak at a community health event, a chance to highlight the importance of equitable medical care. Despite the controversy, he refused to cancel. He arrived early, greeting the organizers and chatting with attendees. The auditorium was filled with a diverse crowd: parents, healthcare workers, and local activists. As Elijah stepped onto the stage, he felt a familiar sense of purpose wash over him. He began his speech, focusing on the need for systemic change in healthcare and sharing stories of patients whose lives had been transformed by his foundation's work. But midway through, a commotion erupted at the back of the room. A group of protesters burst in, holding signs with inflammatory slogans: "No more elitist scams. Healthcare for all, not Harrington's wallet." The crowd murmured in confusion as the protesters shouted over Elijah's words. One man, wearing a cheap suit and a smug expression, stepped forward. "You talk a good game, Dr. Harrington," the man sneered, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "But how much of that money really goes to the people you claim to help, or is it all just a tax write-off for your next vacation?" Elijah's stomach tightened as the man's words spread through the room like wildfire. He stepped closer to the podium, gripping its edges. "Every dollar raised by my foundation goes directly to programs that save lives," Elijah said, his voice steady despite the chaos. "I've worked my entire career to improve access to healthcare for underserved communities. This isn't about me, it's about them." But the man wasn't finished. "Funny how you always seem to come out on top, though," he spat. "Big house, fancy car, and now you're playing the victim classic." The crowd's energy shifted, some murmuring in support of Elijah, others whispering doubt. Elijah scanned the room, his heart sinking as he saw the uncertainty on people's faces. He realized this wasn't just about defending himself. It was about the fight for something much bigger. That night, Elijah sat alone in his office, the protesters' chants still echoing in his mind. He knew he had to respond decisively, not just for himself, but for everyone who looked up to him as a symbol of possibility. He picked up his phone and dialed Mitchell. "I need a press conference," he said firmly. "Tomorrow." "You sure about that?" Mitchell asked. "This could backfire." "I don't care," Elijah replied. "It's time to set the record straight." The next day, Elijah stood in front of a crowd of reporters, cameras flashing as he adjusted the microphone. The tension in the air was palpable, but Elijah's resolve was unshakable. "Over the past 48 hours, he began, his voice steady and clear, "my character and work have been called into question. Let me be perfectly clear. I will not be intimidated by lies, hate, or the forces that seek to undermine progress. As he spoke, he felt the weight of the crowd's scrutiny, but also their curiosity. He laid out the facts, his foundation's mission, the lives it had saved, and the systemic inequities it sought to address. For too long, he continued, people like me, people who look like me, have been told we don't belong in rooms of power. We're told to shrink, to apologize for our success. Well, I'm here to tell you that I won't shrink, I won't apologize, and I won't stop fighting. The reporters shouted questions as he finished, but Elijah stepped back from the podium, his head held high. As he walked away, he felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just a battle for his reputation, it was a battle for justice. The sun hung low in the winter sky as Dr. Elijah Harrington approached the marble steps of the city's largest hospital. Despite the biting cold, the parking lot buzzed with reporters and onlookers. News of Elijah's press conference had spread like wildfire, and public opinion was sharply divided. Some saw him as a trailblazer unfairly targeted, while others swallowed the manufactured scandal whole, painting him as another wealthy manipulator. Elijah's assistant, Valerie, walked beside him, clutching a clipboard with trembling hands. The hospital board is furious, she whispered. They're claiming your involvement in the foundation is a liability now. Elijah paused mid-step, his jaw tightening. Of course they are, it's easier to distance themselves than stand behind the truth. Valerie hesitated, lowering her voice. And the police chief's office called, there's talk of opening an investigation into the foundation's finances. Elijah's stomach turned. On what grounds? Irregularities, Valerie said, using air quotes. But I think it's just pressure from whoever's pulling these strings. Elijah nodded, his expression unreadable. Then we give them nothing to find. Inside the hospital's grand atrium, a crowd of staff, patients, and media personnel had gathered. Camera flashes reflected off the polished floors, and the murmurs of the audience created a constant hum. At the center of it all stood Elijah's ally and longtime friend, Dr. Sophia Grant, the hospital's chief medical officer. She waved him over, her sharp eyes scanning the crowd. We're under siege, Sophia said as he approached, her voice tinged with both frustration and determination. The board's discussing whether to cut ties with the foundation. They think it'll protect their reputation. Elijah frowned. You mean protect their profits? Sophia didn't argue. You're walking a tightrope, Elijah. If you fall, they'll be happy to let you take the blame for everything. Elijah straightened, his eyes blazing with resolve. Then we make sure I don't fall. As the press conference began, Elijah stood at the podium, the bright lights making the crowd a blur beyond the cameras. He spoke with conviction, countering the false narratives with data, testimonials, and his unwavering commitment to equitable healthcare. But as he wrapped up, a reporter at the back stood abruptly. Dr. Harrington, the reporter called out, his voice cutting through the applause. How do you respond to claims that your foundation's board members are involved in an embezzlement scheme? Internal documents suggest that millions are unaccounted for. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Elijah froze, his mind racing. He had never seen such documents, and the accusation was unfounded. But it didn't matter. The seed of doubt had been planted. Sophia stepped forward, her expression fierce. That's a baseless accusation, and you know it, she said, addressing the reporter directly. Dr. Harrington's foundation undergoes routine audits and has never failed a single one. The reporter smirked. Then you won't mind explaining this? He held up a printed document, a doctored financial report showing supposed discrepancies. Elijah's heart pounded as he scanned the page from a distance. It was fake, but it looked convincing enough to spark chaos. The crowd erupted in a cacophony of questions, accusations, and flashes. Security moved to shield Elijah as protesters outside began chanting, their voices growing louder. Sophia leaned in close. You need to get ahead of this now. If you let them control the narrative, it's over. Elijah nodded, his mind already strategizing. Call Mitchell. I want a team analyzing that document immediately. If they fabricated this, we'll expose it. As Elijah and Sophia exited the building, their car was blocked by a line of protesters carrying signs with inflammatory messages. One man stepped forward, his face twisted with rage. Liar! He shouted, throwing a cup of coffee that splattered against the car window. Security moved to disperse the crowd, but the tension was palpable. Elijah felt the weight of every stare, every insult hurled his way. His assistant Valerie, seated beside him, looked shaken. "They're getting bolder," she said quietly. "They're scared," Elijah replied, though his voice was tight. "And scared people lash out." As the car pulled away, Elijah's phone buzzed. It was Mitchell. "Bad news," Mitchell said without preamble. "That document, it's sophisticated. Whoever faked it had access to your foundation's internal files." Elijah's blood ran cold. "You're saying someone on the inside betrayed us?" "Looks like it. And that's not all. An anonymous source just leaked more documents to the press. If we don't move fast, they'll frame this as systemic corruption." Elijah clenched his fist. "Then we move faster. Find out who's behind this, and get me proof." The next day, Elijah arrived at his office, only to find 2 police cruisers parked outside. He stepped out of his car cautiously, as 2 officers approached, their hands resting on their holsters. "Dr. Harrington?" one of them said, his tone clipped. "Yes." "You're under arrest for suspicion of financial fraud," the officer announced, pulling out a pair of handcuffs. The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. "This is a mistake," he said firmly, refusing to let his voice shake. "You have no evidence." "We'll sort that out downtown," the officer replied, grabbing Elijah's wrist. Elijah didn't resist, knowing any sign of defiance could be weaponized against him. As the cuffs clicked into place, he glanced at the small crowd gathering nearby. Phones out, recording every second. He met their gazes head-on, refusing to show shame. Sophia appeared at the entrance, her face a mask of fury. "This is outrageous," she shouted, storming toward the officers. "You can't just arrest him without cause." The officer ignored her, pushing Elijah toward the cruiser. As he ducked into the back seat, he caught Sophia's eyes. "Call Mitchell," he said simply. "Don't let this stand." Hours later, Elijah sat in an interrogation room, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead. The officers had asked questions, trying to rattle him, but he remained composed. He knew the truth was on his side. But as the door opened, an officer entered with a file in hand, his expression grim. He dropped the folder on the table, spreading out photographs of bank transfers and invoices, more doctored evidence. "You've got a lot to explain, Dr. Harrington," the officer said smugly. "Looks like you've been playing us all." Elijah stared at the photos, his mind racing. Whoever was behind this had gone to extraordinary lengths to destroy him. But why, and who could benefit from tearing him down? As the officer leaned in, a faint smirk on his lips, Elijah made a silent vow. Whoever was orchestrating this attack would regret underestimating him. The tension is at its peak, with Elijah facing public humiliation and an unjust arrest. The stage is set for the climactic confrontation, where Elijah will begin to unravel the conspiracy and fight back against the forces aligned against him. The steel door to the interrogation room slammed shut, leaving Dr. Elijah Harrington alone with Officer Daniels, a towering figure with sharp hawkish eyes and a permanent sneer etched into his face. Daniels radiated authority, the kind that relied more on intimidation than integrity. He circled the table like a predator, sizing up its prey, flipping open a folder filled with the damning but falsified evidence that had led to Elijah's arrest. "So, Dr. Harrington," Daniels began, his voice oozing with mock politeness, "it seems you've been running quite the little racket care to explain these financial discrepancies. Millions of dollars don't just disappear." Elijah's hands rested on the cold metal table, his cuffs biting into his wrists. Despite the tension in the room, his gaze was steady. "Those documents are fake," he said calmly. "And I think you know that." Daniels smirked, leaning in closer. "Fake, sure they are. And I suppose the anonymous tip we received about your offshore accounts is fake too. You've got quite a story, Doc." Elijah took a slow breath, his mind racing. He'd spent his career diffusing crises in operating rooms, but this was a different kind of high-stakes battle. "The real story," he said evenly, "is why you're so interested in tearing me down. Who are you protecting?" Daniel's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second, but he quickly recovered. "Don't turn this around on me. You're the one under investigation, and from where I'm sitting, things don't look good for you." Elijah leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "You're right. This isn't about you. You're just a pawn. The real players are the ones who stand to lose the most if I succeed. If my foundation continues exposing inequities in the healthcare system. So tell me, Officer Daniels, who's pulling your strings?" Daniels's expression darkened, his facade cracking. "Watch your mouth," he growled, slamming his hands on the table. "You're not in a position to make accusations." "Neither are you," Elijah shot back. His voice remained calm, but the intensity behind it cut through the room like a scalpel. "Because when this is over, the truth will come out, and you'll have to decide whether you want to go down with them." Daniels glared at him, his jaw tightening. For a moment, silence hung in the air, heavy with unspoken truths. Then Daniels straightened, his sneer returning. "You've got some nerve, Doc, but this isn't a courtroom, it's real life, and in real life, people like you don't win." Outside the interrogation room, Mitchell paced the station lobby, his phone pressed to his ear. Valerie stood nearby, clutching a stack of papers they had hastily compiled to counter the fabricated evidence. The tension in the air was palpable. "We've traced the source of the leaked documents," Mitchell said, his voice low. "They came from a private email server linked to one of the hospital's board members, Alan Redding." Valerie's eyes widened. "Redding? He's the one who's been pushing to distance the hospital from the foundation." Mitchell nodded grimly. "And guess who has a direct connection to Officer Daniels Redding's cousin? This whole thing is a setup." Valerie's grip on the papers tightened. "How do we prove it?" "We need access to Daniels' case files," Mitchell replied. "If we can show collusion between him and Redding, we can blow this wide open, but it's a long shot." At that moment, the station doors burst open, and Dr. Sophia Grant strode in, her heels clicking against the tile floor. Her presence commanded attention, and even the officers behind the desk paused to watch her approach. "I'm here for Dr. Harrington," she said firmly, "and I'm not leaving until I speak with him." Back in the interrogation room, Daniels's bravado was beginning to waver. Elijah's unwavering composure was unnerving, and he could feel the cracks forming in his own strategy. He flipped through the folder again, buying time. "You think you're untouchable?" Daniels said finally, though his voice lacked its earlier confidence. "But everyone has skeletons in their closet." "And I think you're running out of time," Elijah replied. "Because right now, my team is out there uncovering the truth about you and your friends. When they do, this will all come crashing down." As if on cue, the door opened, and Sophia entered, followed closely by Mitchell and Valerie. Sophia's expression was one of barely contained fury. "This farce ends now," she declared, her voice cutting through the room like a blade. Daniels straightened, his surprise evident. "You're not authorized to be here." "Neither are you," Sophia shot back, pointing at the folder in Daniels' hand. "You have no legitimate basis for holding Dr. Harrington. The only evidence you've presented is a poorly executed forgery, and we can prove it." Mitchell stepped forward, holding up a stack of documents. "We've traced the source of the falsified evidence to Alan Redding, a member of the hospital board. He's been funneling money into shell accounts while trying to pin the blame on Dr. Harrington, and we have the emails to back it up." Daniel's face paled, but he tried to regain control. "This doesn't prove anything, you're grasping at straws." "Oh, it proves plenty," Mitchell countered. "Including your involvement, we've uncovered records showing multiple phone calls between you and Redding over the past 2 weeks. Calls that coincide with every major development in this case." Daniels's hand twitched toward his holster, but he didn't draw. Instead, he glared at Elijah. "You think you're so smart, but this isn't over." "It is for you," Sophia said coldly. "Because if you don't release him right now, we'll take this to the press, and when the dust settles, you'll be the one answering for your actions." The station erupted into chaos as Daniel stormed out of the room, barking orders at his subordinates. Within minutes, Elijah was released from his cuffs, and Mitchell handed him a copy of the evidence they had gathered. "You're free to go," an officer muttered, avoiding Elijah's gaze. As Elijah stepped out into the cool night air, Valerie and Sophia flanked him, their expressions a mix of relief and determination. The crowd of reporters outside had only grown, their cameras and microphones poised for a statement. Elijah paused, his mind racing. He knew this wasn't the end. It was merely the beginning of a larger fight. But for the first time, he felt the tide beginning to turn. "I'll speak to them," he said, his voice steady. Sophia hesitated. Are you sure they'll twist anything you say? Elijah nodded. Let them try. He stepped forward, the flash of cameras blinding, as he began to speak. This is not just about me. It's about a system that thrives on silencing those who challenge it. But I won't be silenced, and neither should you. As his words carried into the night, Elijah knew the fight ahead would be long and grueling. But he also knew he wasn't alone. And that was enough. Dr. Elijah Harrington stood alone in the dimly lit conference room of the city's police precinct, his hands flat against the cold steel of the table. The room was stark, devoid of any comfort, the fluorescent lights casting harsh shadows on the walls. Across from him sat Officer Daniels, flanked by two other officers. Daniels' sharp smirk, and the file he toyed with on the table, suggested he was ready for a game Elijah had no intention of playing. You've been causing quite a stir, Dr. Harrington, Daniels began, leaning back in his chair. Public speeches, press conferences. You're making a lot of people uncomfortable. Elijah met Daniels' gaze, his voice calm but resolute. If the truth makes them uncomfortable, that's not my problem. Daniels chuckled, a sound devoid of humor. You really think you're untouchable, don't you? Just because you've got money and a few people rallying behind you? Newsflash, the system doesn't work that way. You mean the system doesn't work for people like me? Elijah countered, his tone sharp enough to slice through the tension. That's why I'm here, to change that. Daniel's smirk faltered, and his jaw tightened. He opened the file, spreading out documents across the table. Elijah recognized them immediately: doctored bank statements, falsified invoices, and reports claiming millions of dollars had been funneled through his foundation into personal accounts. These don't look good, Doc, Daniel said, his voice dripping with feigned concern. Public opinion's already turning. Once this gets out, you're done. Elijah straightened, his hands leaving the table to rest at his sides. He was no longer the one on the defensive. You've been busy, Daniels. But there's one problem with your little scheme. I have the original documents, the real ones, and I've already sent them to my legal team. Daniel's expression darkened, the casual facade slipping. You think that'll save you? You really don't understand how this works, do you? Elijah took a deliberate step forward, his voice steady but brimming with conviction. I understand perfectly. I understand that people like you thrive on fear and intimidation. But I'm not afraid of you, Daniels. And I'm not going to be your scapegoat. The door to the conference room burst open, and in walked Mitchell, Valerie, and Dr. Sophia Grant. Mitchell carried a laptop and a stack of papers, his expression grim but determined. We have a problem, Officer Daniels, Mitchell said, as he placed the laptop on the table. Your entire operation is about to be exposed. Daniels scoffed. You can't just barge in here and— I can, Sophia interrupted, her voice cutting through his protests. Especially when your actions are putting the hospital's reputation at risk. And trust me, the hospital board is not going to stand by you when this comes to light. Mitchell opened the laptop, tapping a few keys before spinning it around to face Daniels. On the screen was a string of emails and financial transactions, all linked to Alan Redding, one of the hospital board members, and Daniels himself. The emails detailed a coordinated effort to fabricate evidence against Elijah, using Redding's resources and Daniels' position within the police department. You've been working with Redding to frame my client, Mitchell said, his voice steady and cold. These emails prove it, and the best part, we've already shared them with the press. Daniels's face turned a deep shade of red. He reached for the laptop, but Mitchell quickly closed it. I wouldn't do that, Mitchell warned, unless you want to add tampering with evidence to your list of crimes. For a moment, the room was silent, except for the faint hum of the overhead lights. Daniel's facade was gone, replaced by a look of desperation and barely contained rage. You don't know what you're talking about, he spat. This is all circumstantial. Circumstantial? Valerie interjected, holding up a folder. We have recordings of phone calls between you and Redding. Do you want to hear them, or should we play them for your boss? Elijah stepped forward, his voice calm but unwavering. You've spent your career tearing people down, Daniels. But this time, you picked the wrong target. I've spent my life fighting for justice, for equity, for people who don't have a voice, and I'm not going to let you take that away. Daniels slammed his fists on the table, his eyes wild. You think you're some kind of hero? You're just another arrogant, a black man who refuses to stay in his place. Elijah finished, his voice rising with righteous fury. That's what this is really about, isn't it? You can't stand that someone like me has built something you can't touch, so you tried to destroy me. Daniel stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. You're out of line. No, Elijah said, his voice steady. You are. The door opened again, this time revealing the precinct's captain, a tall woman with a no-nonsense demeanor. She scanned the room, her sharp gaze landing on Daniel's. What's going on here? Mitchell handed her a copy of the evidence. What's going on, he said, is that one of your officers has been colluding with Alan Redding to frame my client. I suggest you take a look at this before deciding your next move. The captain's expression grew darker as she skimmed the documents. She turned to Daniels, her tone icy. Is this true? Daniels opened his mouth, but no words came out. His silence was answer enough. As Daniels was escorted out of the room under the captain's orders, the weight of the moment settled over Elijah. He had won this battle, but the war was far from over. The scandal had already taken root in the public consciousness, and clearing his name completely would be an uphill climb. Sophia placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. You did it, Elijah. You stood your ground. Elijah nodded, though his mind was already racing. This isn't just about me, he said quietly. If Daniels and Redding were willing to go this far, who else is involved? How deep does this go? Mitchell sighed. We'll find out. But for now, you need to focus on getting your story out there. The world needs to hear the truth. From you. As they left the precinct, a crowd of reporters awaited them, their cameras flashing and microphones thrust forward. Elijah hesitated, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. You ready? Sophia asked. Elijah took a deep breath. Not entirely, he admitted, but I'm not going to stay silent. He stepped forward, the flashes blinding, but the path ahead clearer than ever. The precinct was abuzz with the fallout from Officer Daniels' abrupt removal. Whispers of corruption and complicity rippled through the building like an electric current, leaving no corner untouched. As Elijah Harrington stood in the cool morning air outside, the world around him seemed to move in slow motion. Reporters clamored for statements, their questions a cacophony that blurred into background noise. Sophia, Mitchell, and Valerie flanked him like an unyielding wall, their presence a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. Elijah adjusted his tie, drew a deep breath, and stepped toward the cluster of microphones awaiting him. This morning, Elijah began, his voice carrying across the gathering. We exposed a coordinated effort to destroy not only my reputation, but also the vital work of my foundation. Let me be clear, this isn't just about me, it's about a system that allows people in positions of power to target individuals who dare to challenge the status quo. He held up a copy of the evidence Mitchell had provided. These documents show that Officer Daniels, with the support of Alan Redding and others, fabricated evidence against me to undermine my work. They attempted to weaponize systemic bias against me, but they underestimated the power of truth. The reporters erupted with questions, but Elijah raised a hand to quiet them. This fight is far from over. There are still unanswered questions about how deep this corruption goes. My team and I will not rest until everyone involved is held accountable. As he finished, applause broke out from a section of the crowd, a group of supporters who had arrived to counter the protesters from the previous day. Their signs bore messages of hope and solidarity. Justice for all, and we stand with Dr. Harrington. Daniel's arrest and the exposure of Redding's scheme sent shockwaves through the community. Within hours, the hospital board called an emergency meeting, during which Redding was forced to resign. News outlets began reporting on the scandal, shifting the narrative from Elijah's alleged misconduct to the systemic corruption he had uncovered. Later that evening, Elijah returned to his townhouse, exhausted but resolute. As he sank into his living room chair, he allowed himself a moment to reflect. The events of the past week had tested him in ways he hadn't anticipated, pushing him to confront not only external injustices, but also the quiet doubts that had lingered in the back of his mind for years. Sophia had joined him, sitting across the room with a glass of wine. You know, she said, breaking the silence, I've always admired your ability to stay calm under pressure. But today, you didn't just stay calm, you led. Elijah offered a small smile. I didn't feel calm, I felt raw, exposed. And yet you used that, Sophia replied. You turned it into something powerful, not just for yourself, but for everyone watching. Elijah nodded, the weight of her words settling over him. It's not enough, he said quietly. There's still so much work to do, so many people who face what I faced every day, without the resources or platform I have. That's why they need you, Sophia said. Not just as a surgeon or philanthropist, but as a leader. In the weeks that followed, Elijah's fight became a rallying cry for systemic reform. The scandal sparked public outcry, leading to calls for an independent investigation into corruption within the city's police department and hospital board. Activists and community leaders organized town halls, using Elijah's story as a case study in resilience and the power of truth. The foundation's work gained new momentum as donations poured in from supporters inspired by Elijah's perseverance. New partnerships were formed with advocacy groups, creating programs to educate communities about navigating and challenging systemic injustices. Elijah himself took on a more prominent role as a public advocate. He began speaking at universities, conferences, and community centers, sharing his story not as a victim, but as a testament to the importance of standing firm in the face of adversity. One crisp afternoon, Elijah found himself standing outside a small elementary school, invited to speak at a career day event. He wore a simple blazer and carried a folder filled with notes, but as he stepped into the classroom, he realized he wouldn't need them. The room was filled with wide-eyed children, their faces lighting up as he spoke about his work as a doctor and the importance of perseverance. At the end of his talk, a young boy with dark curls and a shy smile raised his hand. Dr. Harrington, the boy asked, how do you stay brave when people are mean to you? The question caught Elijah off guard. He paused, then knelt to meet the boy's gaze. Sometimes, he said gently, being brave doesn't mean you're not scared, it means you do what's right, even when it's hard, and you don't have to do it alone. You find people who believe in you and fight with you. The boy nodded, his expression thoughtful, and Elijah felt a flicker of hope for the next generation. As Elijah walked back to his car, his phone buzzed with a message from Valerie. We've got a lead on a larger network connected to Redding's scheme. Looks like this goes deeper than we thought. Elijah stared at the screen, a mix of exhaustion and determination washing over him. He knew this was only the beginning of a larger fight, one that would demand even more of him. Sophia's words echoed in his mind. Not just as a surgeon or philanthropist, but as a leader. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the battles still ahead, but also the strength he had gained from those he'd already fought. Elijah opened his car door, the sunlight glinting off the polished metal. As he drove away, the city stretched out before him. A city scarred, but still standing, much like himself. There was work to be done, and Elijah Harrington was ready to do it. Dr. Elijah Harrington sat in his office, the early morning light filtering through the large windows that overlooked the city. The skyline, with its towering buildings and bustling streets, seemed unchanged from when he first moved here years ago. Yet it felt different now, like a canvas he had helped reshape. The past few months had been a whirlwind of revelations, battles, and small but significant victories. For the first time in weeks, the world felt still enough for reflection. Elijah leaned back in his chair, the polished surface of his desk a reflection of his meticulous nature. Scattered across it were the remnants of his latest endeavors, a draft for a speech at an upcoming Justice Reform Summit, notes for a new community health initiative, and a photograph of the children he had spoken to at the elementary school. Their faces, filled with hope and curiosity, reminded him why he fought so hard. He had emerged from the storm stronger, though not unscathed. The fabricated accusations had been debunked, and Officer Daniels, along with Alan Redding, was now under federal investigation for corruption. But the experience had left its mark, a lingering ache in his chest from the realization of how easily the system could turn against him. Yet, instead of bitterness, Elijah felt a quiet determination. He had learned that resilience wasn't just about weathering the storm, it was about finding purpose within it. His ordeal had forced him to confront not only the external injustices, but also his own vulnerabilities, the moments of doubt, the temptation to walk away. Instead, he had chosen to stay, to fight, and to grow. Elijah glanced at the framed photo on his desk. Himself alongside Dr. Sophia Grant, Valerie, and Mitchell, taken after their most recent town hall meeting. They had become more than colleagues. They were a team bound by a shared mission. In their unwavering support, Elijah had found strength, proof that change wasn't a solitary journey. Elijah's story had sparked a movement far beyond what he could have imagined. The exposure of Daniels and Redding had lifted the curtain on systemic corruption, leading to calls for greater accountability in both law enforcement and healthcare. Protests turned into policy discussions, and community leaders began collaborating with activists and reformers to address long-standing inequities. But the fight was far from over. Elijah knew that systemic change was a marathon, not a sprint. The roots of racism, bias, and abuse of power ran deep, intertwined with institutions that resisted transformation. Still, his story had shown that the system wasn't impenetrable. It could be challenged piece by piece by those with the courage to stand up and speak out. One of the most significant changes came from within the communities affected by these injustices. Inspired by Elijah's perseverance, grassroots organizations gained momentum, advocating for everything from police reform to equitable access to healthcare. Elijah himself partnered with several of these groups, using his platform to amplify their voices. His foundation, too, had grown in the aftermath of the scandal. What had once been a quiet force for good now stood as a beacon of hope, its programs expanding to underserved areas across the state. Elijah's focus shifted beyond immediate healthcare needs to include education on systemic injustices, equipping communities with the tools to fight back. For Elijah, the greatest triumph wasn't in clearing his name, it was in the ripple effect his fight had created. He had received hundreds of letters from people across the country, students who saw him as a role model, professionals inspired to speak out in their own fields, and parents who wanted a better world for their children. One letter stood out. It came from a young man in a rural town who had faced racial profiling but lacked the resources to challenge it. He wrote, "Your story gave me the strength to believe that I'm worth standing up for. If you can fight back and win, maybe I can too." Elijah kept that letter in his desk drawer, a reminder of why he continued to push forward. His fight was no longer just about him. It was about everyone who felt unseen, unheard, and undervalued. His story was proof that change was possible, not easy, but worth every step. On a bright Saturday afternoon, Elijah found himself walking through a bustling park. Families picnicked on the grass, children chased each other with laughter, and joggers passed by with nods of recognition. Among them was Jamal, the young boy from the elementary school, who spotted Elijah and ran over with a wide grin. "Dr. Harrington," Jamal said, clutching a book to his chest. "I've been reading about doctors who make inventions to help people. That's what I want to do one day." Elijah knelt to Jamal's level, his smile genuine. "You know what's great about that? You already have the most important part: courage." Jamal beamed, and his mother, standing nearby, gave Elijah a nod of gratitude. As Elijah rose, he felt the familiar warmth of purpose fill him. Moments like this, small but profound, were what kept him moving forward. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Elijah sat on his balcony, the city lights twinkling in the distance. His phone buzzed with a new message from Valerie. "The Justice Summit is confirmed. You're the keynote speaker." Elijah set the phone aside, letting the weight of the moment sink in. The battles ahead would be daunting, but they no longer seemed insurmountable. His journey had taught him that progress wasn't about winning every fight. It was about refusing to stop fighting. Elijah's story wasn't just a personal triumph, it was a call to action. It reminded people that change began with the courage to confront injustice, the resilience to withstand the backlash, and the humility to learn from the struggle. His journey was far from over, but it had already planted seeds of hope in a world that desperately needed them. As the night deepened, Elijah leaned back in his chair, staring at the stars. He thought of everyone who had walked this path before him, who had laid the groundwork for the progress he now fought to protect. He thought of those who would follow, carrying the torch further than he ever could. And with that, he smiled. Not because the fight was easy, but because it was worth it.